across talk shows and social media platforms about accountability, implicit bias, and the fragile trust between communities and law enforcement. Behind the scenes, city officials scrambled, the mayor calling emergency meetings, risk management analysts calculating potential settlement costs, and union representatives defending the officers' split-second decision-making. But the narrative took a sharp twist when investigative journalists uncovered internal emails revealing that the department's vehicle identification software had generated false positives in at least a dozen prior incidents over the past year, incidents that had been quietly resolved without public attention. Suddenly, Vanessa's arrest was not an isolated mistake, but part of a troubling pattern. In depositions, one officer admitted under oath that he had considered verifying her identity through the courthouse directory but decided against it because, as he put it, "We can't assume someone's telling the truth just because they say they're important." A statement that, while superficially reasonable, exposed a deeper reluctance to pause and reassess once authority had been asserted. Meanwhile, Vanessa faced her own internal conflict. As a sitting judge, suing the very system she served risked accusations of bias or conflict of interest, and she voluntarily recused herself from cases involving the city to avoid even the appearance of impropriety, a move that earned quiet respect from some critics who had initially questioned her motives. Weeks turned into months, and the city offered a confidential settlement far below the $3 million requested, hoping to contain the damage. But Vanessa rejected it, insisting that the issue was not merely compensation, but structural reform, including mandatory verification protocols and enhanced training on de-escalation and database reliability. The standoff intensified when a whistleblower within the department leaked training materials that minimized the risk of wrongful arrest as statistically negligible, language that plaintiffs' attorneys seized upon as evidence of institutional complacency. Public opinion remained divided, yet the emotional core of the story lay not in political arguments, but in the image of a dignified judge pressed against hot metal while strangers recorded on their phones, an image that forced Americans to confront uncomfortable questions about how quickly identity can be stripped away in the presence of flashing lights and raised voices. As the trial date approached, tensions escalated further when the defense attempted to argue qualified immunity, asserting that the officer's actions, even if mistaken, did not violate clearly established law. But Vanessa's legal team countered with precedents demonstrating that probable cause cannot rest on superficial database similarities alone. The courtroom became a battleground of constitutional interpretation, with expert witnesses testifying about algorithmic errors and the psychology of authority under stress. Then came another twist. Forensic analysis of dispatch logs revealed that the initial hit-and-run description had been updated minutes before Vanessa's stop to correct the vehicle's color from black to silver, an update that the responding officers either failed to see or ignored, further undermining their claim of reasonable suspicion. When Vanessa took the stand, she did not dramatize her ordeal. Instead, she spoke about the chilling realization that, for a few irreversible minutes, her lifetime of achievement and service meant nothing in the face of a flawed system and an assumption of guilt. And jurors reportedly listened in rapt silence as she described the metallic taste of fear when the handcuffs tightened. The verdict, when it finally came, awarded her the full $3 million in damages and mandated sweeping policy changes within the department, including independent audits of data systems and disciplinary review procedures for wrongful arrests, a decision that sent shockwaves through municipalities nationwide. Yet even in victory, Vanessa's expression remained measured, almost somber, as she addressed the press one last time, reminding viewers that true justice is not measured in dollars, but in restored dignity and institutional reform. In the months that followed, training protocols were revised, the faulty software replaced, and the officers involved faced internal review, though the city stopped short of termination, a compromise that satisfied few completely. Nonetheless, the case became a landmark example cited in law schools and policy forums, a cautionary tale about the dangers of over-reliance on imperfect systems and the human cost of unchecked authority. And perhaps the most enduring image was not of the arrest or the courtroom, but of Vanessa returning quietly to the bench, robe draped over her shoulders, gavel in hand, presiding over cases with the same composure she had always shown, proving that while power can be misused and dignity momentarily stripped away, resilience and accountability can still prevail in a system willing to confront its own flaws. So if this story moved you, if it made you question, reflect, or feel even a fraction of the tension that gripped that parking lot, make sure you subscribe and stay with us, because the next story might challenge everything you think you know about justice in America. What would you do if you watched police officers slam a respected federal judge against the hood of her own car in a grocery store parking lot, all while bystanders filmed and nobody dared to intervene? And what if I told you that less than 24 hours later, that same judge would ignite a legal firestorm with a $3 million lawsuit that shook an entire city to its core? Before we dive into this unbelievable true-to-life story of power, humiliation, and justice turned on its head, make sure you hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because stories like this expose the fragile line between authority and abuse, and you do not want to miss what happens next. It was a humid Thursday evening in late August in the outskirts of Atlanta, the kind of evening where the asphalt radiates heat long after the sun has dipped below the skyline, when Judge Vanessa Caldwell, a respected jurist serving on the bench of the United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia, pulled into the parking lot of a busy suburban grocery store after a 14-hour day reviewing complex civil rights cases. She was still in her tailored navy suit, heels traded for flats, hair pulled back in a tight bun that had begun to loosen from the strain of the day, and she looked less like a symbol of federal authority and more like any other tired professional grabbing almond milk and salad greens before heading home. Vanessa had earned her seat the hard way, graduating at the top of her class from Spelman College before attending Harvard Law School, clerking for a prominent appellate judge, and eventually being nominated to the federal bench in a confirmation process that had been both grueling and historic. But none of that pedigree mattered in the seconds that would follow when two patrol cars from the Atlanta Police Department screeched into the lot behind her black SUV, lights flashing, sirens briefly, chirping as if announcing a spectacle. At first, Vanessa assumed they were responding to a shoplifting call or a fender bender nearby, and she continued placing reusable bags into her trunk. But then a voice barked, "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle, hands where we can see them." And when she turned, confused, she saw two officers approaching rapidly, one with his hand hovering over his holstered weapon, the other already holding a pair of handcuffs. The accusation came fast and blunt. The SUV matched the description of a vehicle involved in a hit-and-run earlier that afternoon, and the registered owner's name, Vanessa Caldwell, had been flagged in a system error that conflated her with a different Vanessa Caldwell who had an outstanding warrant in another county. She tried to explain calmly, identifying herself as a federal judge, offering her driver's license, even pointing to the federal courthouse parking decal on her windshield. But the younger officer scoffed and said, "Everyone's somebody important when they're in trouble," a sentence that would later echo in depositions and court transcripts. Bystanders began filming as one officer grabbed her arm and twisted it behind her back, the groceries spilling across the asphalt, avocados rolling toward the storm drain. And when Vanessa instinctively protested the force being used, she was pushed against the hood of her own vehicle, the metal still hot from the sun, her cheek pressed into it, while the cold bite of handcuffs snapped around her wrists. Someone in the crowd gasped. Another whispered, "Isn't that Judge Caldwell?" But the officers, caught in the adrenaline of a public arrest, doubled down instead of reassessing, and within minutes, she was placed in the back of a patrol car as her phone, still recording a voice memo from earlier, captured fragments of her strained breathing. At the precinct, the situation unraveled quickly when a supervising sergeant finally ran a more detailed check and realized the warrant belonged to a woman born in 1989, not 1968, with a different social security number and address, and that the hit-and-run vehicle had a dented rear bumper while Vanessa's SUV was pristine. Embarrassment rippled through the room, but no apology came immediately, only a stiff, procedural, "You're free to go," delivered as if she had merely overstayed her welcome, rather than been publicly humiliated and physically restrained without probable cause. What the officers did not anticipate was that Vanessa, though shaken, was not just any citizen with a grievance. She was a jurist intimately familiar with constitutional law, particularly Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches and seizures. And by the time she returned home that night, bruises forming on her wrists, she had already begun documenting every detail in meticulous notes, her training kicking in like muscle memory. The next morning, instead of quietly returning to the bench, she called a press conference on the steps of the federal courthouse, flanked not by political allies, but by two seasoned civil rights attorneys. And in a voice steady yet edged with steel, she described the incident without theatrics, emphasizing that her status as a judge should not grant her special treatment, but that what happened to her happened to countless ordinary citizens who lacked the platform to demand accountability. She announced her intent to file a $3 million civil lawsuit against the city and the officers involved, citing unlawful arrest, excessive force, and violation of civil rights under Section 1983, and the crowd of reporters erupted and shouted questions while cameras flashed. The lawsuit, filed the very next day in federal court, alleged systemic failures in training, reckless reliance on flawed database matches, and a culture within the department that discouraged officers from admitting mistakes once an arrest was initiated. And within hours, national media picked up the story, framing it as a dramatic collision between judicial authority and street-level policing. Some commentators argued that the officers were simply doing their jobs in a tense environment, while others pointed to the long history of racial profiling and questioned whether a white male judge would have been treated with the same dismissiveness when identifying himself. As the case unfolded, body camera footage was released, and though the audio was partially obscured by traffic noise, viewers could clearly see Vanessa calmly stating, "I am Judge Caldwell of the United States District Court," only to be met with skepticism and escalating physical control tactics. The footage went viral, sparking protests outside police headquarters and reigniting debates across talk shows and social media.